Episode 1: First Arrival in Chicago. At the end of August, when autumn was ready to bid adieu, making way for winter, the sun hung overhead in the afternoon, and a heat wave came to a little town called Fairfield. On the second floor of the town's Central Health Institute, a girl casually leaned against a shabby door. She wore a simple black and white shirt, and her collar crooked when she lowered her head. Her sleeves were folded up. She wore a pair of low-rise jeans that were a little old and stretched at the waist, and exposed some skin. She definitely stood out. When the nurse saw a man pass by the girl for the third time, she handed the girl a lollipop and scoffed towards the ward. "Bessie, are your parents here?" Bessie Miller focused on unwrapping the candy. "Probably," she replied and put the lollipop in her mouth. The nurse scoffed. "I haven't seen them." Then she hurried away with the medical record. Inside the ward were Bessie's biological parents, Grace Smith and James Miller. The two have been divorced for over a decade. Bessie had been raised by her grandmother, who had fallen ill and had to transfer hospitals, so Grace and James had to come back. Bessie leaned against the wall, one leg curled slightly as she listened indifferently. Through the door, one could hear Grace Smith's indifferent voice. "James, my mother is in a serious condition. I will take her to Chicago for treatment." James looked at her confused, seemingly mocking her. "Bessie has dropped out of school and no school in Fairfield has accepted her. You can take her to the Smith family. They have connections and will definitely find a good school for her." "I've already brought Anne into the Smith family, yet you want me to bring another child in? What will the Smiths think of me?" Grace was a little annoyed with his endless pestering. What school would easily accept a student like Bessie? James was clearly resentful. "I wanted to take Anne with me back then. You're pushing Bessie on me just because you don't want her." They had 2 daughters. Bessie and Anne were only 1 year apart, but they were worlds apart in other areas. They had fought relentlessly for Anne's custody when they filed for divorce. In the end, Anne wanted to live with her mother, and the case was finally closed. At the time, no one wanted Bessie. The two evaded her custody and didn't care about her. Grandmother Bertha Wilson had taken pity on Bessie and was raising her alone for 12 years. In the hospital room, Grace looked at the mocking face of James and held her anger back. Compared to Anne, who would wish to take in a daughter who constantly caused trouble? Besides, she would have to take her into a prestigious family, and Grace didn't want to be looked down at. James grew up without parents and was poor when he married Grace, but after a few years, she couldn't stand James's lack of ambitions and left him. After their divorce, Grace brought Anne along into her next marriage to a rich man in Chicago. James also quickly remarried. He had a son with his current wife and led a prosperous life. James had nothing to lose, while Grace was afraid that he would really go to the Smiths' house and embarrass her, so she reluctantly took Bessie back to Chicago. "Bessie, you." James came out of the ward, saw Bessie, and paused. He sighed. "The Smiths are rich. Follow your mother and they will definitely find a good high school for you. You might even go to college after. With Bessie's grades, could she even be accepted to college?" James only said it casually. James had a son now, and it was not a small responsibility. They had yet to buy a house in the city and still had to plan for the future. His current wife told him beforehand not to take Bessie back. Bessie ignored her father, narrowed her eyes, and looked in the direction of the window down the hallway. Her eyes were cold. A few feet away from the window, there was an office. The young man, dressed in a minimalistic white coat, was sitting on a chair. He was a handsome man with a clean face. He was the new director of the hospital, Robert Soup. Mr. Soup glanced at the high-end sofa across from him that didn't match the hospital decor. He noticed a man who was lying on the sofa, with a cigarette pinched between his long fingers. Pale smoke rose from his folded arms, and his eyes seemed to be frozen in place for half a minute. Mr. Soup followed his line of sight. "What are you staring at?" The man was wearing a black silk shirt and was nestled on the sofa. He smiled and replied, "Quite a thin waist." He turned his head to the side. His nose was pointy and his skin extremely white. His eyes were gray and half squinted, as if he had just woken up. His voice was hoarse and low. Huh? Mr. Soup flipped through the pages of his medical record and didn't follow. He looked up at his charming colleague and thought it wasn't difficult to understand why all the men and women in this city were crazy for this head teacher. None of your business, said Michael Clark, stretching his long legs, as he leaned on the sofa and chuckled. Then he said, Go back to Evanston once you've finished your mission in 2 days. What about you? Asked Robert. Michael stood up, eyes narrowed. He reached out and patted the imaginary ashes and said dismissively, I have another mission. Mrs. Smith's car was just downstairs. It was a black BMW with Chicago's license plate number. After negotiating with the doctor, Grace directly took Bessie and Bertha back to Chicago. The Grace family has a lot of rules. Don't bring your bad habits there, you hear me? Grace tilted her head and rubbed her brows. Bessie only carried a black backpack, which she put on her lap. She squinted a little sleepily and nodded indifferently. She carried the aura of a bandit from head to toe, and Grace wasn't sure if she even processed her words. Grace had been of a high social status for 12 years now, since joining the Smiths, and was now extremely graceful. What she hated most was the rebellious flair that Bessie had in common with James. Bessie took a pair of black headphones from her pocket and didn't care much. Don't be so rude. If you were half as good as Anne, I wouldn't be nagging you so much. The Smith family is different from your grandmother. Your words and deeds will affect your younger sister. Even if you don't care about yourself, don't drag Anne down. Grace uttered. At the thought of having to find connections and have the Smiths put Bessie through the senior year, Grace became more and more irritable. With Bessie's current situation, she was afraid that even if they searched the whole of Chicago, no school would be willing to accept her. Grace had relied on her good looks to marry David Smith, a real estate businessman who lost his wife. Anne had been extremely clever even as a kid and was a pretty girl as well. She had excellent grades and outstanding talents. She never let the Smiths worry about her studies. No matter where she was referred to as a role model. The Smiths were extremely proud of Anne. Grace was naturally happy to bring Anne into the family, but the thought of bringing Bessie in, she lost her appetite for lunch. The black BMW stopped in front of the Smith family's house in Chicago at 4 p.m. Ma'am, a middle-aged woman in a blue shirt opened the door. She was surprised when she saw Bertha and Bessie behind Grace. Grace felt a little stuffy and was visibly upset. Aunt Ruth, bring my mother and Bessie in first. Anne will be done in school soon. I'll pick her up. Anne was always picked up by the Smith family's driver. Today, Grace went to pick her up personally because she was frustrated and didn't want to face Bessie at home. So, she went out to take a breath. Aunt Ruth watched Grace leave. Then, she turned to the two and looked at them suspiciously. Mrs. Wilson. Bessie. She was looking them up and down, then said, Come in. She led the way, pressing her lips at an angle where the two couldn't see. They stopped at the hall, and Aunt Ruth was about to take out the slippers. But Bertha walked in with her shoes. After Bertha stepped in, she noticed Aunt Ruth staring at her in surprise. Although she was from the countryside, she always preferred things to be clean and didn't have much dust on her heels and clothes. Aunt Ruth's stare was heavy, but her granddaughter was beside her, so Bertha tried her best to ignore Aunt Ruth's stare and straightened her back. She took a step back and wanted to change her shoes, but Aunt Ruth shoved the slippers back inside. There were a lot of guest rooms in the house. Aunt Ruth couldn't tell what Grace's current attitude was, and took the two of them to a room on the 3rd floor. At the corner of the 2nd floor, there was a half-opened door with a violin in the room. While passing, Bessie gave it a second glance. Aunt Ruth looked at Bessie and said blankly, This is Miss Anne's music room. Bessie raised her eyebrows and followed Aunt Ruth. She thought to herself that Anne was very favored in the family. The guest rooms upstairs were slightly dull. This is the bathroom. You know how to use the water heater, right? Aunt Ruth opened the bathroom door and introduced it as if the two were cavemen. Bessie sat on the low table with one leg slightly bent. She fiddled with the flowers placed on the table. "Rest first. If you need anything, just call me. I'll be downstairs." Aunt Ruth said a few more things before heading down to the kitchen to help. After she left, Bessie locked the door. Bertha looked at the beautiful, spotless room and thought for a long time before smiling. "This Aunt Ruth looks pretty. Easy to get along with. Next time, you and your mother." Bessie dumped the contents of her backpack onto the table. She raised her eyebrows but didn't reply. Bertha watched as Bessie played with her stuff and didn't disturb her. This granddaughter really had a lot of weird things. She remembered that one time she found a gun on her bedside table and she'd been really scared. But Bessie later told her it was just a toy gun. Bessie sat on the table with her legs bent and fiddled with the contents of her backpack. She carelessly placed a laptop with a logo, which looked quite new, on the table. Then, she took out a very heavy mobile phone. She proceeded to throw it on the table as she'd always been messy. She then picked out a white plastic bottle from the pile of items and shook it. A messy B was drawn with a black pen outside and a note was attached. Bessie tore off the sticky note and wrote a string of characters on it. She looked at it for a while and then tossed it aside. She only held the white plastic bottle in her hand. She tilted her head and looked at Bertha, then tossed the bottle into the pile. A while later, Aunt Ruth came up and knocked on the door. "Mr. Smith and Thomas are back. They're both downstairs and want to see you." The Smith family was a rich family and had been known for 3 generations in Chicago. David Smith wasn't 50 yet and didn't have the confidence that people of his age usually had. His youthful style, gentleness, and elegance could still be vaguely seen. His eyes under the gold-rimmed glasses always showed the sharpness that had been honed from his years of business experience. Even Bessie thought that her mother was lucky to have married Mr. Smith. Downstairs, David was whispering to Thomas. After all, she had to bring a daughter back again, and Grace didn't have the guts to make the decision. So, she called David when she was at the hospital. "I heard she left school for a year after making a serious mistake. She is also a big troublemaker. It's a bit annoying for her to be brought in." David thought about Grace's request and frowned. But trouble was under his nose. The Smith family never had such a rebel before. Thomas frowned, put one hand on the sofa, tilted his head and pressed his phone as if he was talking to someone. He didn't even lift his head when David was talking, and was obviously very uninterested. But when he heard movement on the stairs, he raised his eyes instinctively and glanced there. He was stunned. Will this small town's beautiful bandit be able to survive with renowned and respectful Smiths, who already consider her unbearable big troublemaker?